prior to Survivors of the Void, what's currently Burn used to actually be two different debuffs, with Burn coming from enemies and Ifrit's Distinction, and Ignite coming from Artificer, Gasoline, and Molten Perforator. They both dealt base damage, and even though they had different damage per tick and tick rates, it came out to 200% for both Ignite and Burn. In only a single use, Flamethrower used to be able to take out a Stone Golem at level 1, but that's no longer the case, and even though the description says it did 1700, it was actually 4,295%. With Flame Bolt, for example, the 200% base damage that Ignite applies, Artificer starts with 12 base damage, and each tick is 25% of the base damage, so you can see it ticks 8 times with 3 damage. But then Hopeful Games thought it would be a good idea to basically turn Burn into the Overloading Orb, so 50% total damage, except it scales with duration and not tick damage. So pre-DLC, when a single Flame Bolt would have done a clean 420%, it now ticks in intervals of 1 damage 11 times, since 11 is 50% of 22, the original damage of the Flame Bolt. And Artie's best damage ability was dropped from 4,295% to 2,615%. The big issue here is that there's a hard cap of 50% damage per second of the final damage, and there's no way to bypass it. Luckily, it does work with Ignition Tank, which effectively raises that to 150% per second, but it still takes the same amount of time. You'll see why this is an issue in a little bit. Gasoline was almost unchanged. It still deals base damage on the explosion, as you can see 150% here, 12 into 18. But the Burn itself was converted into Ignite, and it behaves the same as Artie's kit, where it deals total damage. And pre-DLC, it obviously ticked slower and did more damage per tick. Here's why the new change doesn't work. In almost every situation, total damage is going to be better than base damage, but the moves that were already in the game that procced Ignite benefited from base damage and not total damage. The rework accomplished 3 things. It punishes high attack speed, low damage moves, high damage single use moves, and it makes Ignite on enemies stupidly hard to deal with. To explain why a total damage rework would be bad for a high damage move, think back to when I said that it scales with duration and not tick damage. In this clip, Diablos Strike applies a single stack of Ignite, and it's going for over 3 minutes in intervals of 1 damage before it goes away. When the DLC was initially released, it actually used to be much worse on enemies with a buggy code, and you could have stuff like this happen, where you get hit once and are running around with a single stack of Burn for over a minute. Luckily, about a week after the DLC came out, they released a patch that fixed a lot of the bugs, but it's still stronger than it used to be, just not as broken as it was pre-patch. But there's also this post-patch clip where, yeah. Something like Loader's M1 has Ignite going out pretty quickly, but when I tested it with Punch, same thing happens with it lasting an extremely long time. And when I mentioned Ignition Tank earlier, the duration stays the same, just the damage per tick goes up. I usually try and end off on a positive note in that it's not all bad, but to me this change was probably one of the worst decisions they've made, and when you have stuff like Gesture going this long without being nerfed, that's kind of a bold statement. Ifrit's Distinction is just outclassed by Overloading Orb in every way, besides maybe Deathmark, and it nerfed Artie, really the only character that benefited from Ignite in the first place. Luckily they did add the attack speed buff so that Flamethrower scales with attack speed now, which is really nice, but all in all I think they should have just never changed it in the first place. That's about it. See ya.